Good morning, everyone, and welcome to Pennsylvanians for Modern Courts One-Day Law School for Journalists. I'm Debbie Gross, the CEO of Pennsylvanians for Modern Courts. I want to thank the Knight Foundation and Cozen O'Connor for their sponsorship of this program. I also want to thank all the amazing panelists that you will be hearing because this is truly an exciting program. PMC was established over 5 years ago after a report from the Pennsylvania Judicial Reform Commission found an appallingly low level of confidence in Pennsylvania's judicial system arising from the election of judges and the corresponding conflicts from raising monies. PMC was created to advocate for a number of judicial reforms as well as on behalf of an independent judiciary. We realize that most people are not aware of the importance of the judiciary and its impact on their lives. So PMC has expanded its educational outreach to Pennsylvanians and across the country about our court system or about the court system through a series of educational programs, which we bring to community organizations, libraries, schools, on a wide range of topics, including One-Day Law School for Journalists, right? We have a court watch program where we train individuals to observe court proceedings. We produced 2 reports last year. Most recently was the report from a partnership with Temple Law School about with students observing early bail review hearings. This summer, we piloted a high school program providing opportunities to learn about the judicial system. Students met with lawyers and judges and observed court proceedings. We also expanded our civics program this year. We went into 10 different schools on a monthly basis with a judge and a lawyer to teach about civics, the judiciary, and the law. And as you can see, we hold our One-Day Law School for Journalists to help journalists, the press, and the media understand the court system on which they are reporting. Lawyers have difficulties understanding the complexities of the legal system and court cases, and they have at least 3 years of training. Last year, our program provided basic information about legalese, civil proceedings, criminal proceedings, and right to know requests. You can view the programs from last year on our website, www.pmconline.org. Based on feedback we received, and yes, we do listen to your feedback, so please make sure when you get the survey, you fill it out. We decided to go beyond our core curriculum, I'll say, and address current topics such as covering elections, high-profile trials, judicial ethics, and court record or document sealing. Journalists and reporters are the firewall of our democracy. While judges are limited by their code of conduct from publicly speaking about pending matters and cases and issues before them, you, the press, can shine a light on their decisions and on court proceedings. Since both judges and the press hold unique positions among our democratic institutions, the independence of both and their freedom from undue influence are necessary to safeguard the freedoms and rights of all of us. Both the press and the judiciary have faced challenging times during the past years, but nevertheless, I truly believe both institutions are stronger, and as a result, have encouraged increased citizen participation and interest in our democracy. We have an amazing program planned today, and over 200 participants have registered. As a result of this terrific interest, participants are all muted. However, please put your questions in the Q&A and I will monitor them and bring them to the panelists. The program will be recorded and it will be available for review on our website. We also publish, I'll say, these programs on public access television. You will be sent a follow-up survey to complete, as well as a PowerPoint of resources compiled from each of the panelist presentations. Your feedback is truly appreciated. So I want to thank you for joining us, and we will begin with our first panel, From Rules to Reporting, a Journalist's Guide to Covering Elections. Thank you. So, Kathy, do I want to lead it off to you, or?
I think we decided that Melissa and Paula are going first. So
sorry, thank you.
Okay. Yeah, sure.
Hi, so I'll start and I'll introduce myself, and my fellow panelists can do the same as they start their talk. I'm Melissa Melewsky. I'm in-house counsel with the Pennsylvania NewsMedia Association, and in that role I wear a lot of hats, but one of the biggest hats I wear is to staff their legal hotline. So journalists from across the state and across the nation can call me to get advice on access issues, court issues, right to know, sunshine, defamation, invasion of privacy, First Amendment. I mean, kind of you name it. If it has to do with what you do as a journalist and it's legal, I'm your first line of defense. And I'm happy to be here today to talk to you. And I'll let Paula introduce herself as well.
Good morning, everyone. I'm Paula Knudsen Burke, and like Melissa, I am an attorney here in Pennsylvania. I work for the Reporters Committee for Freedom of the Press. Some of you may have used the Reporters Committee resources. It's rcfp.org, and I'll put it in the chat. But we've got lots of resources. If you're a journalist attending today from a different state, we have our open government and open courts guides for every state in the country. And there's a lot of valuable information. So should I turn it over to Marc and or Kathy, Melissa, or are we going to carry on?
Let's just carry on. And then when Kathy and Marc they'll weigh in when they get here. But because we're only going to be very brief and give you a thumbnail sketch of what Pennsylvania law says about access to election materials. And like Debbie explained in the intro, Pennsylvania statute and regulatory law make most election records presumptively public, subject to some limits on how they can be used and by whom. And there are kind of a few administrative hoops you'll have to jump through in order to get access to certain records. But the presumption is under statute that most election records will be public because, like Debbie explained, free and fair elections are a cornerstone of our democracy. And the way to guarantee that things are actually working the way they're supposed to is to have access open and readily available to not only the public, but the press in whose shoes and the press is standing in the public's shoes. So they have to have the same access that the public does. And under the First Amendment, you do. Do you want to add anything to that general intro, Paula?
Nope.
Okay, so with regard to specific types of records, the ones that I hear about most often are, I'll kind of split them up into records that are available all the time, records that are available things you might be interested in pre-election, and things that you might be interested in post-election, and what happens on election day, like at the polling place, for example. That has more to do with physical access. And Marc and Kathy will weigh in on this as well as we get in. But from a records perspective, voter lists, street lists, records that show you name, date of birth, political party affiliation, address, those are all going to be presumptively and public under Pennsylvania's election code. Now, for Pennsylvania journalists, you know that the right to know law is typically the way you access public records in Pennsylvania, but because there's a more specific law here, the election code, we put the right to know law to the side and we look to the more specific law here, which is the election code and its provisions regarding access. In order to access some of those records, you have to, in some cases, be a registered elector. Each county does it kind of a little bit differently, and I'm hoping to get Kathy's input on this because I know the Department of State gives each county advice on how to run it, but ultimately it is advice. It's not a directive. And each county does it a little bit differently. I've seen forms that say you have to be a registered elector in the county where you want to access records. I've seen other counties say if you're not a registered elector here, you have to prove to us that you are in fact eligible to be a registered elector in some other Pennsylvania county under constitutional provisions. And some counties don't ask at all. It really kind of varies widely depending on which county you're in and how it's run. But if you want access to the state level voter information, so the Department of State makes the entire export available. I think it's $20, and you have to sign an affidavit that says you won't use them for non-political or inappropriate purposes. Obviously, what you do as journalists is political. You are part of the process you are part of the political process. So I had a reporter ask me last week about the affidavit that they had to sign to get access to these records that says they will only be used for election and political purposes and not for anything commercial. And their question to me was, do I qualify for that as a journalist? I'm reporting on the elections. I'm like, yes, the First Amendment activity is, first of all, protected activity, and it is political and it is not commercial in the sense that these regulations and statutes are talking about. Commercial means you're going to resell the list typically, and that's not what journalists are doing. So that's kind of records in a nutshell. Paula.
Yeah, I just wanted to say, some of you may have followed that there's a lawsuit in the U.S. District Court for the Middle District of Pennsylvania, which is one of our federal courts here in Pennsylvania that challenges the use of that full voter export list. It was brought by an entity called, I'm sorry, I'm scrolling back up, Voter Reference Foundation, LLC. And it gets at that idea that Melissa was talking about regarding the use of the list, because the list that you can buy for $20 is very extensive. And so this group wants to use it for purposes beyond what it is currently allowed for. So that's an interesting case, and it's pending. I checked the status this morning on Pacer, but you know, journalists typically are some of the main users of these lists because they contain so much helpful information, including things that you can verify. If there's two John Smiths or someone with a common name, you can use that database as another point of reference. So I just wanted to pop that case in there in case anybody was wondering about an update.
And it's also important to recognize that there is a specific provision in Pennsylvania's regulations that I think is really the crux of that lawsuit is you can't publish the list on the internet, and it says so right in the regulation. There are similar limitations in other states as well. This same group has challenged those in federal courts and other jurisdictions. I think most recently New Mexico struck down a similar provision in their statute on federal court struck that down on constitutional First Amendment grounds. We'll see where Pennsylvania's federal courts end up, but that case is about being able to publish the list. And as far as I'm aware, I've never had a journalist say, can we put this list on our website? Journalists are using it as background information, like Paula said. With regard to accessing records after the election, obviously some things become public after the election because they're created as a byproduct of the election. You don't get to see the contents of ballot boxes. And there was a recent case from the Commonwealth Court that said that includes images of the returns. Paula, what's the right terminology there?
Digital ballot.
Digital ballots, yes. So you don't get the contents of the ballot boxes, but the process of opening and counting, that's all a public process, and you're allowed to witness it. And the places where those things happen have to be open and accessible. There are certain people who are allowed in a polling place during an election, so access on the day. Obviously all poll workers, watchers, and I have had journalists here in Pennsylvania register as watchers under the statute, so they have access above and beyond the 10-foot radius for the polling place. Pennsylvania's election code puts a 10-foot barrier around the polling place for electioneering activity as well as First Amendment activity that's been applied to the press. Different jurisdictions define what the polling place is differently. The statute itself defines it as the room in which the ballots are cast, but some locations define it as the entire building, and they have a 10-foot barrier around the entire fire hall, church, whatever the polling place might be. So that's something you want to think about, and we'll talk more about that a little bit later. But the big concept here is that Pennsylvania law requires most records, most locations, most subsequent, proceedings that follow the election. If there are challenges to a ballot or an election proceeding, those are all presumptively public. Now, how you get access to them will differ depending on your location. But the big point I want you to remember is if you're looking for election records or access to places, you are more than likely protected both by Pennsylvania law and the First Amendment.
And just one more thing about the kind of the intersection between the campaign finance law and the right to know law, which is Pennsylvania's public records law. In March, the Office of Open Records put out a report talking about how many cases are still pending and percolating from the 2020 election that deal with campaign finance or campaign records and the right to know law. And I think, was that just last week, Melissa, one of the cases came down. So the Office of Open Records has said that they are still processing 2020 right to know elections requests that are then making their way through trial and appellate courts in Pennsylvania, and it's been a huge uptick. So just a caveat there to say that this area of public records law, as it pertains to these voting related records, continues to evolve. And I think we likely will see even more uptick in those right to know law requests with the interest in this year's presidential election. So the post on that is about the demand for election records is on the Office of Open Records website from March of this year. And it's an interesting read just about the huge uptick in interest in these kinds of records.
And I'll just mention to kind of jump off what Paul is talking about with regard to campaign finance. When I'm talking about going to, sometimes you will actually have to physically go to a county election office to look at their records, because you can inspect any time under the statute during regular business hours and when the records aren't being used by election officials for their job. But when you don't have to visit, and that's frequently, there's a wealth of information online available proactively to you. So you should be able to access it easily and without jumping through administrative hoops. The Department of State has reams of information about candidates, campaign finance, lobbyists, expenditures, the voter registration kind of master list is all available affirmatively to you. And there's really not a lot of hoops you have to jump through to get it. So when Paula and I talk about public records requests or these forms you have to sign at individual counties, I would explore the things that are affirmatively available to you without jumping through those hoops first. Sometimes the hoops will have to be jumped through, and you'll have to, have documentation and ID and things like that. But if you don't have to do that, it's more timely and more in your interest to get what's available proactively leading up to your coverage.
Melissa, should we say a word, just a little extra word about the 10-foot polling place?
I think Debbie's going to ask a question about that later.
Okay,
so I think we'll cover that.
Okay.
And we'll throw it back to you, Debbie, to bring Kathy and Marc into the conversation.
So I want to welcome Kathy and Marc, and I'm going to let you each introduce yourself, and then we're going to talk about some situations that, like, we want you to understand what's really happening and stories that have actually happened. So Kathy, feel free to take over. Thank you very much.
Sure. Hi, everybody. Happy to be here. Thanks for having us, Debbie, and thanks for organizing this. So I'm Kathy Boockvar, and my first job in elections was actually as a poll worker. So I started out at the most local level in the precincts, became a voting rights lawyer, and down the road became Pennsylvania Secretary of State. And I'm still doing election security and voting rights work, but I do it nationally. So part of what I was going to bring into this conversation is also some comparative laws. And, I think Marc and I are both going to talk some about how these things play out on the ground. But I wanted to make sure if there are folks attending who are also covering other swing states, that we can cover some of that. And if there are particular issues that people are interested in, like, say, physical security issues for election officials, voters, and infrastructure, there's a ton of information that I'm happy to provide either during, if we do it through questions and answers, or afterwards. And if you're interested in that area, safeelections.org. You could get a ton of resources from the Committee for Safe and Secure Elections at that website, including pocket guides, state-by-state pocket guides on laws that are already on the books in every state that help protect election officials, infrastructure, and voters. So I'll stop there, kick it to Marc, and then I think we're sort of doing this by a bit of Q&A, right?
Hi, I'm Marc Levy. I am a Statehouse correspondent for the Associated Press in Harrisburg. For about 20 years now, I've covered the major developments under the dome in Pennsylvania, as well as races for governor and races for U.S. Senate. Of course, I've probably interviewed Paula and Melissa and Kathy dozens of times, and they've been of tremendous help to the Associated Press over the years.
Great. Thank you, Marc, for joining us. Really appreciate, honestly, everybody's time given the news that's coming out. And so I know that even the journalists who are watching, I appreciate your joining us. So, Kathy, do you want to talk about, I guess, how different states go about, handling the physical security of election officials, the voters, the infrastructure?
Sure. Yeah. And Debbie, and I don't know, and this may be something, as Melissa and Paula were talking, I started jotting down some notes about like particular areas that I think reporters may want to be paying attention to for the rest of this year, both here and across the country. So I'll start with your first question, but then, and I think Marc, you'll be able to talk about the on the ground pieces of how those things played out in past years and how they're likely to pay out as well. But Melissa and Paula, all the things that you were saying, made me start typing up a whole bunch of things that I think would be useful for us to talk about as well. So, but on the physical security issues, just Melissa and Paula covered a lot of the issues in Pennsylvania. So I'm just going to talk about, as Melissa and Paula made reference to, every state is different. And in Pennsylvania, on a lot of topics, every county is different. So it's a very decentralized system of elections that we have. And while some states, a few states, are a little bit top down, where there's some state agency, Department of State or State Board of Elections that tells the counties or the municipalities what to do, most states are bottom up. And so if you ever have questions about the rules on anything, start with the county, start with the municipality. But as a general rule, I will say, so the distance from polling place, for example, the rules on how close reporters or anybody else can be is sort of a perfect example of how different it is from state to state. So Melissa and Paula mentioned for Pennsylvania, it's 10 feet from a polling place, which I will tell you is, I believe, the shortest distance from a polling place, like the closest that people are actually allowed to be. Most states, it's much further. So for example, Michigan, people can't election year within 100 feet of a polling place. Now, reporters may have a little bit more leeway in Michigan than that. You may be able to interview voters a little closer than 100 feet, but the general rule is 100 feet. Arizona, it's 75 feet. Wisconsin, it's 100 feet. But again, I think there was litigation. So Wisconsin journalists may conduct exit polling, permitted it's not disruptive, within the 100 feet. Georgia, no conducting exit polls or opinion polls with voters within 25 feet. Nevada, it's 100 feet. Though they also had litigation, and media can do closer than that. But you can see, like, no one is talking about 10 feet like Pennsylvania. Everywhere else, it's much further. So just be prepared that Pennsylvania is not the norm if you're going to other states. One area that I think a lot of people are interested in right now is weapons, guns in polling places. And I have found that there's a lot of people who think that guns are prohibited in polling places. And the truth is that's not the case in most places. So in Pennsylvania, there's no provision prohibiting guns in polling places. However, there are statutes that prohibit guns on school property, guns in court facilities, and a lot of polling places in Pennsylvania are in schools and some are in court facilities. So, that's an area where we actually do have some leeway to prohibit guns in polling places. Michigan, weapons are prohibited. They don't have a polling place specific law, but weapons are prohibited in school zones and churches. Arizona and Georgia and Georgia both have specific polling place prohibitions. So Arizona, guns are prohibited in polling places. In Georgia, no carrying of firearms within 150 feet of any polling place or inside. So those are places where they've passed specific laws. Again, most places haven't. I don't want to go on too much detail, but I guess I'll talk about just a couple of other areas, unless Debbie, you want me to stop here and ask more questions.
I was just going to ask Marc, I mean, have you have you had any problems or encountered any situations where you've been, 10 feet and not allowed to interview or, or poll, or encountered any safety issues, those kinds of things? And what have you
Ye-
done?
Yeah, well, so I'm embarrassed to admit I didn't know about the 10-foot rule, or that Pennsylvania is somehow far more advanced than other states. But I've stood outside of polling places hundreds of times across Pennsylvania, and urban areas and suburban areas and rural areas. And I can't remember a time that I was told to leave. I can't remember a time that I was confronted by a police officer or an official with the church or the firehouse or the school or the municipal building or whatever it was. I was standing outside who told me to leave. I can't remember a time that a judge of elections came out and told me to leave. Obviously, you have to be polite in your interaction with voters. But I've always had good experiences standing outside of polling places. I think Kathy alluded to the idea that an individual polling place may define its boundaries differently. And so does that mean, the doors to the outside? Does that mean the room inside where people are voting? I've been inside of buildings interviewing people, for instance, in the library. I've stood outside. I've walked into a municipal building in a rural part of Pennsylvania to photograph a candidate who was voting, and no one said anything. And if memory serves, I feel like we've seen photographs of people like Ed Rendell or candidates for major office, walking into and out of polling places, or moving aside the curtain where they're voting. So different polling places will have a different tolerance for journalists, and also for people carrying a camera. If you're following a candidate in, they may not say anything because they assume the candidate wants to be photographed voting.
Marc, can I ask you about? Oh, sorry. Go ahead,
I'm sorry.
Melissa.
I just want to, and I'll get right out of your way, Kathy.
No.
This is where I tell journalists that if you know you're going to be covering an area, it's a good idea to reach out in advance to your county election officials to see what their status is. Some are going to be much more flexible than others. And if you're going to hit a roadblock, you don't want to hit it on election day. You want to hit it a week or two out, so that if you do need to bring legal action or or get your lawyer involved, you have time to do it. Because doing it on election day, everybody's worried about something else. You're not their first priority on that day. So in advance is probably a good idea.
And for the newsrooms who have assignment editors or somebody who can be making those calls and planning it out, it could mean even calling, the library, the church, just to make sure you understand where the room in which the voting occurs is happening as it relates to the rest of the building and that layout. So you want to try to get as much information in advance as you can, so that you can say, I talked to, or my editor, the assignment editor talked to Fred, and he said this spot was okay. Here's the email. So just to try to avoid any problems the day of, as much advanced research as you can do is really helpful. Sorry, Kathy and Marc, but
No, and I was going to ask Marc a similar question, which is even one step more local. What for best practice, Marc, would you tend to introduce yourself to the poll workers or judge of elections of the polling place where you're planning to station yourself for a little bit, or do you just do your business and hope that nobody's going to come out and say something?
So I've never felt the need to introduce myself to the people on the sort of in the inner sanctum of the polling place, the judge of elections or the workers there. They're busy doing what they're doing. There may be like a greeter outside who guides an arriving voter to where they need to sign in. But I'm always frank that I'm a reporter. You do have to be very honest with voters and identify yourself early and often. And it's probably a good idea to wear your newsroom badge around your neck. I think people pretty quickly that will identify you as a reporter. You're probably going to be carrying a tape recorder or a pad or, in some cases, a video camera. And it's not like you're sneaking up on anybody. And so if somebody wants to come and say something to you, the judge of elections will find out pretty quickly that you're there. But I mean, I have to say that, they're often flattered that you as a reporter chose that place to station yourself and interview voters, and they're just as curious about you as you are about interviewing voters. And so I've had judge of elections come out and ask me, what am I hearing about the election, or what are voters saying? I've also never had a problem getting a judge of elections to come out and talk to me about sort of the technical things that are happening. If there's any problems, if often what I'll want to know from a judge of elections is the turnout. What sort of turnout are you seeing? Because these are people who have done this many times and they have a feel for turnout by a certain time of day. Is this a heavy day? Is it a light day? Is something unexpected happening? So I have to say that I've never had a problem. That's not to say that reporters won't have a problem. But yeah, I typically am dropping in on polling places for a very specific reason. It's in a hotly contested congressional district, or it's in a swing area where I'm likely to find both Democrats and Republicans voting in a nationally watched election, so I can interview people of both persuasions. But yeah, I can envision where, say, someone will tell you to get off the church grounds or the school grounds or the grounds of the municipal building. I've never had that happen to me. I don't know if they're in the right to be able to tell you to do that, if indeed the doorway is far away from the sidewalk.
Melissa's shaking her head.
Oh, no, they can't. I mean, these are private. I mean, often, obviously a church, a fire department, oftentimes they're either fully private or quasi-public locations, but they are on election day, because of the nature of what they're doing, they are government actors and they have to comply with the First Amendment. So no, they can't tell you to leave because they don't want press coverage of an election. That would be a significant First Amendment problem.
So it's very interesting, Marc's experience, which I think, it really shows you the difference between, law and practice in this area, right? And I think it's funny because there are other states. So for example, where it basically actually codifies in statute what Marc is saying his experience has been in Pennsylvania, even though it's not in Pennsylvania statute this way, but where journalists are allowed to, briefly film, inside the public area, like for example, a candidate voting, as long as it doesn't, invade ballot secrecy and nobody's inconvenienced. So back to Melissa and Paula's point about this too, like just know if you're going to other states or other counties, it'd be good to know what the base rule is before you go, I think, because you don't want to find out at the last second by, after the fact. And Marc, it's really quite amazing that nobody has ever asked you to leave. That's pretty impressive. Debbie, you want to go to the next question rather than having me go through more of the.
Well, I guess the other question is like, what is the, I guess, how do journalists handle sometimes sensitive information, right? We talked about voter poll identification or voter registration identification and that kind of information. And, there's certain information. There was a question from a person, an attendee, that asked about, can a voter's data be shielded if they are protected from a domestic violence or a stalker? Like, they're sort of two different things. You may not know that there is this protection order out there, but I don't know if you can answer that or not, Kathy.
Yeah, I can answer it, and probably Melissa and Paula can answer this as well, right? You want to go ahead? You want me to do it?
You go ahead and I'll jump in if there's anything I want to speak about.
Okay. Yeah, basically the answer is yes. There are, if you have a protection from abuse order or some similar reason that gives you a reason to want to keep your information private, you can absolutely do that. And there's a process. You ask the county. One of the areas, this is one of the areas where where like threats against election officials and threats against judges and other public officials has been an issue, because that's not specifically a category of permitted protection under Pennsylvania law. Other states have been passing those laws where they say certain public officials can have their information private. I understand that, similar to many other things, that some counties have actually just been letting people ask for for certain public officials to have their information be private, but there's no specific law that allows say an election official to say, I want my information private because I've been getting threats. If it's non-specific threats, if it's not like protection from abuse order. Melissa or Paula, anything you would add to that?
Yeah, I mean, I certainly agree with what Kathy has already said. There are provisions in Pennsylvania law that allow certain individuals to have their information taken away from the otherwise public voter information list. But from a journalistic standpoint, obviously one of the key points for journalism ethics is you don't want to harm the subject of your story. So that's something as a journalist you want to think about. Is this information necessary to my story? If you're dealing with a specific voter, would the story about that specific voter, does it need the information that could potentially is there a potential for harm? Is the information necessary? And not just, you want to think about not just as a personal safety issue for the individual you're reporting on, but also from a liability standpoint for your news organization, because ultimately you don't want to be caught up in an invasion of privacy lawsuit or, obviously there are newsworthy exceptions to the invasion of privacy statutes here in Pennsylvania, but those don't stop a lawsuit from being filed. They provide you an affirmative defense if one is filed. So you want to avoid litigation if possible, and newsworthiness and potential risk to the subject of your story should be part of your considerations as you move forward and as you talk with your editor about what your story is focused on.
And so, Marc, have you ever encountered any situation where somebody has actually reached out? You've interviewed and they've said, maybe somebody you've interviewed and they've said, I'll give a comment, but I don't want you to put my name up there or my address. I don't want to be tracked down. I'm concerned with the repercussions.
Yes, I'm struggling to think of when that's happened in an election context, but there are voters who may not want to use their name, and for me and the Associated Press, that's we won't quote someone anonymously expressing an opinion. That's part of our standards. So if a voter doesn't want me to use their name, then I won't interview them. I might just listen to what they have to say because that's interesting in and of itself, even if I'm not going to be quoting them. But yeah, there have been times where after the fact, when you've interviewed someone and there was an agreement that this was an on-the-record interview and they gave you their name and so on and so forth, they decided after the interview that they did not want you actually to quote them or use their name. And as I said, I can't think of an election context or a voter context where that's happened. And each situation is going to be its own unique situation where, you as a reporter and a news organization have to weigh the pros and cons of quoting someone anyway, depending on how important that information is. But I've never quoted a voter who did not want to be quoted by name. There's plenty of voters out there to talk to who are comfortable using their names. There's no reason to use somebody's name against their will, if they decide they don't want it used.
Have you, have you ever actually gone in and made a request to inspect the ballots, and the process and information about the process?
I personally have not, no.
Yeah. And Kathy, do you know of any, there is a right to, request that, right, to have public inspection of the ballots and the process. And have you any advice, I guess, for the media about that?
Yeah, I mean, and it's interesting. I mean, so I think Melissa and Paul, you were referencing some of the ballot images cases, and this is a national issue, and some states are allowing ballot images to be reviewed, and some aren't. And I believe there was at least an interim decision, an appellate decision in Pennsylvania or Third Circuit. I can't remember. Maybe you guys remember, saying there's no requirement in Pennsylvania to provide. Pennsylvania as one of the strongest constitutional provisions of ballot secrecy. So that's the whole issue here, is the concern of, could there be some way of connecting a ballot or ballot image to a voter? And that's, very, very strong in Pennsylvania to have protections not to allow that. There are other states like North Carolina, for example, where North Carolina actually has codes on their, I think numbers on their ballots that correspond to a particular human. And the advantage of that is that it allows, say, somebody to actually know that their ballot is through whatever part of the process. And let's say, in North Carolina, if you've cast your mail ballot, say 3 weeks before election day, and 1 week before election day, or whatever their end date is for doing it, if you want to change your vote, you can actually do that because they can track that ballot. In Pennsylvania, once your ballot is scanned, there's no connection to you. So that's the whole balance here. Deb, back when I was a voting rights lawyer, I went through boxes and boxes of provisional ballots after an election. You can get access to all those things by the right to know request process, and the counties have to provide them. Again, there's not going to be a connection between the ballot and the individual voter.
But even when the counties provide them, I'm presuming, right? A reporter can't just go in and isn't just handed the box of provisional ballots. There's other so voters know there's other securities provided there as well, right?
100%. So everybody should like, for voter purposes, I mean, there are layers of security and privacy and integrity of every step of every process in the elections. Like, elections were designed to be complex because the complexity adds security. Of course, the complexity also makes it hard to understand, but it's, but there's a balance there. But yeah, what happens, so maybe we should just, maybe it'd be helpful for me to talk a little bit about mail ballot processes in general. Because it both shows the sort of, it shows the security and how the system works. So for example, in Pennsylvania, we don't just mail ballots to people. Some states do. Some states, they mail ballots to everybody, and that's how people vote primarily. But in Pennsylvania, you have to apply for a ballot. You have to enter your social security number or your driver's license number. You're matched against one of those databases. You're matched against the voter database. You have to have all kinds of information. You have to assert that you are who you say you are, and you haven't, and before you even get a ballot, right? So once you're authorized as a valid voter, they'll mail you the ballot to the place that you direct, right? It's going to the place that you asked for it. And that ballot, the outer ballot envelope, has a barcode, just the envelope, not the ballot, has a barcode that is tied to you, solely to you. And so when you fill out your ballot and you do everything that you need to do, sign the outer envelope, send it in, the first thing that the county does is it scans that barcode. And that barcode, if it doesn't pull up that you're an approved voter who's been matched against those databases, they won't count the ballot. So it protects the security of the process to make sure that only eligible and approved ballots are being counted, but it also protects the process of making sure that other people can't be sending in ballots, right? You have to be an approved voter. So, but then after pre-canvassing, and canvassing with the ballots, what happens is the ballot is separated from the envelope. So both are maintained as records, but there's no connection between the ballot and anything that has your name on it or anything that you've written on it. I mean, you may know this. The in Pennsylvania, we have those secrecy envelopes, right? You've probably all heard about the naked ballot issue. The inner secrecy envelope, you can't mark at all. Like even just writing a scribble, you're not allowed to do. It will void your ballot. Again, tied to the fact of secrecy of the ballot. There's a fear that somehow if you wrote even like a scribble, that might be able to have somebody connect you to that ballot. So,
but the reporters could access both piles of information, right?
exactly.
It's just that they can't connect to them.
Correct. And that's, and that would all happen through the right to know process.
Thank you. And so I'm going to change a little bit, but there's people go into ballot booths and take selfies all the time, right? And, there's a First Amendment right for an individual private person to publish that selfie, but can reporters then use that, that selfie? Can they disclose that person has, gone to vote, check, do some research on who that person is, those kinds of questions?
Yes, yes, there's nothing in Pennsylvania law that prevents the press from using an image that they have legitimately obtained. And for example, when a person posts their ballot selfie on their publicly accessible Instagram or Facebook or Twitter or TikTok page, can you pull that? I think from a First Amendment perspective, yes, you can. I think there are copyright issues you want to think about, and is there fair use? Is this someone else's image? Do you have the right to use it? Should you use it? But from a purely can you use it? Yes, you can. Should you use it is a different question that has kind of a multi-layered process that you'd go through with your editor. But Pennsylvanians can take them. You, the journalist yourself, can take them. I know you never want to become the subject of a story, but ultimately, ballot selfies are allowed. Obviously, you want to be careful if you are in there taking your own picture. Typically in Pennsylvania, you're surrounded by a privacy curtain for all the reasons Kathy just talked about. But if for some reason you would be, you shouldn't be taking a photograph of yourself, but accidentally capturing someone else's ballot process, that would be bad. Don't do that. But yourself and anyone else you can legitimately obtain through the internet or through permission from the selfie taker is fine for news gathering purposes.
So it's interesting. I know that in the ballot and where my place where I go to vote, there's no curtains anymore. And it's just these cardboard, in essence, cardboard dividers, because I'm actually using a pen that I fill out the ballot. It's not even electronic anymore where I am. And so, I worry if somebody's trying to take a picture of themselves and they can catch somebody else in the polling place or in the voting. So we don't have that kind of privacy anymore.
The Department of State kind of addresses that issue in their guidance to county election officials, and they talk about that exact issue and just say to voters generally, hey, if you're going to do this, we recognize there may be a First Amendment right to do this, but you want to be careful about only capturing yourself. And there's really no way for election officials to police that. They can't inspect your selfie before you leave the polling place, for example. So it's something, if you're going to do that, selfie yourself as part of the ballot box, you want to be very careful about what you're catching in the background. And obviously putting in your news site.
Yeah, I think, Debbie, my polling place is similar. And I could definitely, as a bad selfie taker, I could see myself, holding it up and being like, hey, and then suddenly I've captured Melissa next to me. It could be troubling. So just take care if you are the journalist as part of your gathering process. Taking that photo, just make sure you know what your boundaries are, and not to be capturing other folks what they're up to, since it is within the polling place. And
obviously a careful pre-publication review. If you would happen to get an image that does capture someone in the background, we have technology that allows you to blur that out.
Right.
Can I just bounce off of what Melissa pointing out, guidance and directives earlier? I just want to make sure everybody is. So if you're looking to practice in any of this stuff or figure out sort of where you want to be going between now and November, the Pennsylvania Department of State website is a really good place to start. And all the directives and guidance are on the website, every single one, including archived ones. So if they've updated it since 2020 or 2022, there's an archive section so you could see what changed. There's a ton of information there, and it's really helpful, I think, to get a sense not only of what the laws are, but what's not in the law. Like the under Pennsylvania law, the Department of State has the ability to basically give guidance, as Melissa said, to the counties in areas where there's not clear statutory requirements or prohibitions. And so there's, which is why also there's a lot of litigation. There's been a lot of litigation. There's always a lot of litigation in presidential years. There will continue to be a lot of litigation, but you can get a very good sense of the starting point on everything from logic and accuracy testing, like what testing machines is required. By the way, that's a good area where, even though there's not, I don't think there's anything specific in Pennsylvania law about reporters' access. A lot of counties allow the public and press to attend those. It's a really good way for you to get a sense of all that goes into an election and preparing for the election. I want to give a plug for audits, post-election audits, because, everybody sort of knows about whatever election day, these are the places to be, these are the things that are going to happen, but things like post-election audits. So things like pre-election testing and programming of voting systems is a key area that you all should be familiar with. Post-election audits are an area that I really want to ask you all to cover in every opportunity that you have, because every sort of education or polling of voters has shown that when voters understand that there are these post-election audits, in Pennsylvania, we have two different types of audits. We have county audits they audit a sample of 2% or 2,000 ballots, whichever is less. But then we also started in 2019 statewide risk limiting audits, which help confirm that the results of an election are accurate. And our first one was in 2019, and we did it again in 2020, 2021, and since. The more voters know that system, that process happens, and that if you could actually see the information, the data, and see that it mirrors the results of an election, or doesn't for that matter, the more they understand that, the more faith they have in our election processes. So, but most don't hear about it. You can be part of it. Most counties let you be in the room, let you be watching the process, let you have access to all the data. So I highly encourage everybody to please cover that.
I think that's a great point. I'm actually wondering, Marc, is there or Melissa or Paula, do you know of any reporters who have done that, or is this something that this is, I'll say, a new encouragement, because it does. We do need to give people confidence in our election system.
I mean, I'm certainly aware of journalists who cover pre, during, and post-election, especially if there are controversies that have arisen during the election. The post-election coverage is broader and more in depth than in a non-controversial year. But I don't know the last time we've had a non-controversial election in the past. But
the audit process too that they undertake, that's an added level of comfort, I'll say, or security.
Yeah, I think that would be a great subject for coverage as well. Ultimately, we can't control editorial coverage, and the journalists, the news organizations make their own calls there. But yeah, I mean, I know many journalists work closely with their county board of elections to cover the entire process, including post-audit elections. So yeah, the more that happens, I think the more confidence that the journalists can do to instill in the election process itself.
So we have 1 minute left before I have to say goodbye to you and move to the next panel. So I'm just wondering if anybody has any further parting words of advice or suggestions to journalists covering the election this year.
Can I just say one thing that I think transitions to the next session? If things go south and there's litigation, whether it's in federal court, county court, those proceedings themselves are open. Those documents should largely be open. During the 2020 election, we saw, of course, as everyone knows, a number of lawsuits filed throughout Pennsylvania in both Court of Common Pleas and federal courts. The vast majority of those documents should be open to inspection and access, as should the proceedings. So if journalists become aware of a proceeding either before the election or after that's in court and they're being told this is sealed, stay tuned for the next panel to tell you what to do. But that's another way of being able to make sure that we understand the integrity of elections by being able to observe and understand any litigation that is tied in with those challenges. So the next session on sealing, I think, will be really helpful. If you ever hear those words on any lawsuit, including election litigation, you should definitely push back.
Thank you. Melissa, Mark, Kathy, any other parting words?
Nothing from me.
All right. Thank you
I-
all. Oh, sorry.
I'm going to give one more plug, which is if you're covering Pennsylvania, if you can also, in addition to what we were talked about, remind folks that Pennsylvania is one of, I think, 4 states in the entire country that don't allow election officials to pre-canvass those mail ballots. So everybody, like, the more you can be telling people that this is what the legislature has decided in Pennsylvania, which means that lots and lots of ballots are not being canvassed until after election day. That's why it takes several days. That several days is normal. It doesn't mean there's a conspiracy. It's a matter of time. If you have millions of ballots and you can't start till after election day or till on election day, that takes time. So just the more you could be covering that as a normal process, that would be helpful also in building trust.
And if
so
you have questions, don't be afraid to reach out to me at the PNA legal hotline. I know the Reporters Committee has a legal hotline for journalists as well. We get lots of calls on election day and the days following election. So we're resources available for you to use.
Thank you. And we will circulate a list of resources after this program to everybody who's attended. So thank you all very much for beginning this morning with, this is a great topic right now, given the news from the weekend and what's going to be happening in the next couple of months. So thank you all for joining us. Truly appreciate it. Have a good day.